Hey, welcome back to another episode of Balkanomnicon. I'm Jasmin Mujanović. Thank you for continuing to listen to this program. It's been really terrific. The outpouring of support, all the streams, all the kind messages I've been receiving from you guys, a really limited amount of personal harassment and threats, and I'm not even sure that was directed at the same Jasmin Mujanović. So, just bang up job, guys. Really appreciate it. Very grateful. Thank you. Again, my continuing pledge to you is that you will not be hearing quite as much of my voice. Instead, you will be hearing the really fascinating people I've had the tremendous honor and privilege of inviting to this program, and they've all been so gracious and so kind with their time. This week's guest, especially gracious, and you will realize very quickly why within the first few minutes of our actual conversation. So again, a big shout out to Casey Michel for all of the time with which he has provided me with. Casey, the guest in question, is the head of the Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation. He's based out of New York City. He's an old friend of mine, someone I've had the real pleasure of knowing for the better part of 10 years, in fact, just over. Casey has written now 3 really incisive books, the first being American Kleptocracy, which came out in 2021, Foreign Agents, which came out in 2024, and now his third book, United States of Oligarchy, which is coming out in just a few months. He writes about kleptocracy, he writes about global corruption, he writes about this both from the specific focus of the United States, but there is also a really significant international dimension to his work, in particular in this most recent work, which is the United States of Oligarchy, as I said. So I was really pleased when Casey said he had a bit of time and interest in speaking with me. Our conversation goes all kinds of fascinating places. We cover everything from Batman to the significance of immigration, to Central Asia, to Citizens United, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I really enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed all of them to date. And again, my sincere thanks to Casey, all of the preceding guests, and once again, my sincere thanks most of all to you for listening and supporting this project. So without further ado, here's Casey. All right, folks, welcome back to Balkanomnicon. I am here with my good friend Casey Michel. Casey, I'm going to acknowledge something that I think probably you're not supposed to acknowledge if you're doing a semi-professional podcast, which is that this is the second time that you and I are recording. And it's not because the conversation the first time was so titillating that we felt like this has to continue. It's because we're both, dare I say, functional idiots, and neither one of our audio setups were they needed to be. Let's just put it that way.
I will take full responsibility for not switching over to the proper microphone. Hopefully I sound a little bit better this time around. And you know what? If we screw it up again, we'll just keep going until we get it right.
You know what? It's going to be a Groundhog Day podcast where we keep having the same conversation. Casey, thank you very much, really, for your generosity of doing this a second time. I very much appreciate it. It was very kind of important to me, actually, to have you on the program because I just think you're a really interesting guy and I think you're really doing important work. I've known you for a long time, I could say. We met in the early 2010s, I should say, in New York City when we were both at Columbia. You were doing a master's degree. I was a visiting scholar there. Your work has evolved significantly since then. You are the author of 3 books now. You have a third forthcoming book. Your first book, Foreign Agents, came out in 2021, American Kleptocracy in 2024, and now the United States of Oligarchy coming out in a few months. Can you tell us a little bit about this third book?
Well, look, it's very kind of you to describe my work as something that's been evolving. I wish I could take full credit for it, but of course, it's the way the world has gone, and especially dynamics in the United States of America. And yes, Jasmin, if we had a time machine to go back 10 years, 12 years, maybe longer when we first met, and to tell you this is the kind of conversation we would be having, I don't think I would have believed it in the slightest. And yet here we are. So yes, the next book is coming out in August of this year, United States of Oligarchy, How America's Wealthiest Ally with Dictators Weaken the U.S. and Destroy Democracy, which is a really uplifting and optimistic subtitle there. But this book is about really what it says in the title. It's about the United States of America's transformation into an oligarchy. And again, the book goes through both the historic definitions, shifts in understanding, some of the scholarship on topics like oligarchy, but really where things are, both in terms of the broader understanding of oligarchy as a phenomenon, and of course where things are in the United States of America right now. It is a country in which the wealthiest few control the levers of power and prioritize policies for their own personal benefit rather than for American interests. These aren't necessarily public officials. Of course, you have figures like the Trumps. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is one of the primary figures in the book. Those all have either official positions or, in Kushner's case, as an envoy position. But you also have figures like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and a number of other figures who, again, you and listeners are perfectly familiar with, who don't necessarily have public titles and public positions, and yet nonetheless control significant amounts of policymaking and decision-making in Washington and elsewhere. The core of the argument, and again, it builds off of previous work that I and plenty of others have done. The core of the argument is that America's wealth inequality, spiraling, rocketing wealth inequality, is now a national security threat. Not just a threat to American democracy as such, but also now a threat to American national security, which is what I'm hoping the book will push the conversation forward on. Again, of course, there have been plenty of great scholars and politicians, plenty of other writers talking about wealth inequality, but I'm hoping to build upon that to push the conversation forward a little bit more.
Sure. And it's I can tell that you're not passionate about this subject at all.
No,
that
very boring.
Very indifferent. It could go either way for you. No. So I want to be a pedantic political scientist with you a little bit. And I want to talk about some of this terminology. Two terms obviously jump right out in your work here. I mean, they're in the titles literally, and I have them sitting all on my shelf here. I mean, not the recent one, it's not out yet. But kleptocracy, oligarchy. So for those of us who are, let's say, familiar with the broadly understood post-communist world across Eurasia, this is a term that we are most used to hearing in the context of, say, a Russia, a Hungary, the Western Balkans, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you, for your purposes, how do you understand kleptocracy? How do you understand oligarchy? And how does it manifest, you think, in the United States?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So kleptocracy literally means rule of thieves. If you break down the actual origin of the word, that is what it means. And you can still apply that to certain regimes, whether it's Russia, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Serbia, the list goes on and on. These are all kleptocratic regimes in which those rulers are dedicated, again, not to national interests as such, but private interests, and stealing and looting from the populations, looting from infrastructure budgets, healthcare budgets, education budgets, the list goes on. These are all kleptocratic regimes. But in the 21st century, what I write about in the book, and again, what others have written about, is that kleptocracy is now an international or transnational phenomenon in which that stolen money no longer remains in that country of origin. It now crosses borders, crosses hemispheres, and all too often ends up hidden and laundered in places like the United States of America or the United Kingdom or Canada, or again, pick your nominal democracy. All too often that money ends up there because of the tools of anonymity those democracies provide. Anonymous shell companies, anonymous real estate investments, anonymous private equity investments, and so on. And that is really kleptocracy in the 21st century. It's no longer limited to a specific regime or a specific figure. It's now international in scope, transnational, and we're talking about trillions of dollars stolen by these autocratic and kleptocratic regimes around the world that is hidden in places like the United States. So that's kleptocracy. Oligarchy is a term that you can also look at the core root of the term itself, and that literally means rule of the few. And this was a term that was first popularized by Aristotle thousands of years ago. And even in those initial origins of his usage of that term, there was already the kind of confusion you can see that maybe we'll talk a little bit about in this conversation, because Aristotle realized, or what he described, is that you can't simply describe a polity, a nation, a country as an oligarchy if it's simply a few people controlling it. If it's you or me or our kids or whoever it is, even though there's a small number of people overseeing a country or a nation or a state, that doesn't necessarily make it an oligarchy. There's another dynamic at play, and that is wealth. What Aristotle described then is in many ways what we still look to, what we still use as the primary definition of oligarchy, and that is the rule of the wealthiest. Not just the wealthiest in terms of a broader class, a broader upper class, or thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals, but a small sliver, a small cohort of the absolute wealthiest. So you still see the number, there's still a few of them, but it's not just the fact that it's a few of them, it's also that it is those who have the most money to control the most levers of power. And again, they don't have to be public officials, they can be in the private sector, but that is what oligarchy comes down to. And I will say, and I'm rambling at this point, Jasmin, but there's one thing in the book, because there's one scholar who I just want to make sure to mention, a guy named Jeffrey Winters, who's over at Northwestern, who's done really great work on this, and I was lucky enough to talk to him for the book, and he made a point, and again, maybe we'll talk about this in the conversation. You know, oligarchs, if you're in the United States, you have this image of an oligarch being some kind of Russian businessman or Ukrainian businessman or Kazakh businessman or, you know, maybe even a Serbian businessman. And you think to yourself, you say to yourself, okay, oligarchy is something that happens over there. Oligarchs are something that happen over there. And these figures are oligarchs because in the privatization of the 1990s, they used illicit or underhanded means to gain their wealth. But what Jeffrey Winters has pointed out, and what we've begun seeing more of in the last few years, is it doesn't matter where they got their money or how they got their money. If it's legal, if it's illegal, if it's illicit, if it's in drug trafficking, wildlife trafficking, or if it's in the creation of pick your major tech company in the United States. All that matters is not where you got the money, how you got the money, but how much money you now have, and then beyond that, what you're using that money for.
So I want to thank you, I think, for being probably the first person to date on the podcast to have name dropped Aristotle. That feels significant. And of course, the only slightly less famous Jeff Winters. Big shout out to Jeff.
Just slightly.
Just slightly, yeah. Slightly fewer citations on the.
Give him a few thousand years.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So I think all the points that you're raising I take well, rather. Pardon me. And I feel like what's in the back of my mind here is that there's a kind of temporal element, if I could put it that way. The golden era of Russian kleptocracy was in that immediate post-Soviet period, where you're kind of ripping the copper out of the walls, et cetera, et cetera. It feels like there's a time element when we're talking about what has happened in the United States over the past, say, 20, 25 years. There's been some significant legislative, and there's been some, major, I think, court decisions as well, and also perhaps some technological aspects. If we think about the role, for instance, of cryptocurrencies, and you talk about anonymity and all the rest of it. And to my mind, and you're the expert, but when I think about the stuff that I've read about the subject in the context of the U.S., it seems like the Supreme Court Citizens United decision feels like a particularly significant inflection point. Is that right? How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's 100% right. And look, I think, generally I had an idea. Generally, I think most Americans have an idea of what Citizens United was and maybe some understanding of its impact on American democracy. But it wasn't really until diving into the research for this new book that I had a new appreciation for just what damaged the single court ruling, which built upon a number of other court rulings preceding it, actually had for American democracy and beyond that for American oligarchy. So for the listeners who aren't aware, this was a Supreme Court decision back in 2010 under President Obama's first term, in which the Supreme Court effectively allowed corporations in America, any kind of corporation, a big corporation like Amazon or Nike, or even the kinds of shell companies that kleptocrats love to use in the United States, effectively allowed them to give as much money as they wanted to campaigns into American politics as they could potentially want. So again, we're talking not just a couple $100 here or a couple $1,000 here, but we're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions, eventually totally, in totality, billions of dollars, perfectly legally from corporations into American politics. And look, even in just a domestic context, that is devastating for what it means for the overall fairness within and even access to American politics. Because, look, it doesn't take a lot to explain that suddenly if you have the most money and you're the biggest donors, then those in politics realize that they need to prioritize your interests and your preferred policies if they want to continue tapping into those donations and make sure those donations don't go elsewhere. But that's one element of it, and that's devastating in and of itself. But what you alluded to earlier is that, and again, what we've discussed earlier in the conversation is you have this broader international context as well of foreign kleptocratic regimes realizing, oh my goodness, look at this open avenue we suddenly have, and in many ways perfectly legally, to inject our own money using all of these tools of anonymity via things like American shell companies, to take that money and then move it not into things like real estate or private equity, but move it right back into American politics. And suddenly you have this big blinking light saying American politics are for sale, not just for domestic constituents, but now for all of these regimes. And again, it's not just the Russias or the Hungaries, it's the Egypts, it's the Gabons, it's the Malaysias of the world, all of whom are overseen by authoritarian or kleptocratic figures, and all of whom want policies that they would love to see passed in the United States of America.
I mean, it's the Gabons that you got to keep your eye on. Really, I've always said. No, I mean, your point is still well taken, right? I mean that because of the nature of these changes, even sort of relatively marginal. Not even states. I mean, your point is it's regimes. It's individuals actually within regimes who are able to loot their own people. Yeah. And then use that money for all kinds of illicit activities through trafficking through our banks and institutions. Do I have that right?
Well, yes, absolutely. And again, it's not even look. Gabon is its own thing, and has had its own interactions and intersections with American politics. But it's not even just states themselves, right? Yeah. It is stateless. It's these kind of subnational. There's whether in Somalia or most especially Republika Srpska, which maybe we'll talk more about, right? Absolutely. And in that case, as far as we can tell thus far, it wasn't even about injecting money into American politics. It was simply about hiring the right lobbyists, even if they weren't following the transparency requirements they should have been following, but hiring the right people because they knew they could directly access a White House that is open for business to get sanctions lifted. I mean, again, that's just one example of the many we have seen.
That's right. Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, I think folks who listen to this podcast presumably will be familiar with what's happened. Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb secessionist, hires Michael Flynn as well as Rod Blagojevich, a number of other high-profile, shall we say, right-wing influencers who have access to this White House. As a result, very quickly thereafter, sanctions relief follows. And now, moreover, there is a company in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it is a company that is registered in the fine state of Wyoming. It has no registered employees. It has only two known principals, the brother of Michael Flynn and the lawyer of Michael Flynn, who are seemingly in the process of securing multi-million, $100 million, $200 million specifically is the figure that we've heard for the construction of a pipeline project. So obviously raising some very serious questions at the very least. I wanna ask you though something that's kind of apropos this. We talk about like the international level here, and I wanna press you a little bit on this. I mean, one of the things, again, that's happening in the background of all of this I would say even going back 50 years, from the late 70s onwards, is you do have a very significant liberalization of global free market systems, what we sometimes refer to as neoliberalism. Corporate taxes are falling across the board. Labor unions are being devastated. Social welfare systems are being rejiggered in a very, very significant way. And yet it seems like up until, dare I say, maybe the early 2000s, even those kinds of very dramatic legislative changes and political economic changes are embedded within a broad rule of law framework. Now, we can argue to what extent it's being applied always fairly, but it does feel like after Citizens United in particular, we see a very significant decline in the quality of rule of law in the United States in particular, and that has a huge toxic knock-on effect across the globe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, from your lips to God's ears, right? You're preaching to the choir right there. It's funny. You're talking about rule of law. What many of those who partake in these kinds of networks would argue is that they are simply following the law as such, especially after Citizens United. They are not necessarily committing any crimes in either organizing these shell company networks or in accepting funding that maybe they don't know, maybe they don't need to know, maybe they're not asking any questions whatsoever about the provenance of those funds because they don't need to ask any questions.
Right.
Of course, beyond that, even if they are participating in these networks, they know full well that the current administration is not willing to and will not target them for any high-level prosecution as long as they are supporting the administration, or even things like the Federal Election Commission, which is supposed to oversee the rules and regulations of American federal elections, is completely toothless. Purposely so. So these individuals, these, let's call them kleptocratic or oligarchic networks, do not need to be concerned about any kind of prosecution or investigation, even if they are breaking the law. But yeah, no, I mean, Jasmin, you see this as well as anyone. The decline of rule of law, the decline of America's democratic bona fides has all kinds of knock-on effects, not just domestically, but around the world. What had been previously the supposed bastion of democratic, this democratic bulwark globally is suddenly knocked off its pedestal through its own doing. We're only just learning about what the knock-on effects of that are going to be, both now and in the future.
Right. And so we've talked a fair bit about the United States here. I want to try to get your take on this and in a desperate search for some vague good news. What we've seen take place over the course of this administration, though I think it has a backstory as well that certainly has applied to democratic administrations as well. Across the Atlantic, we have this other major political and economic powerhouse that is the European Union. And the European Union has its own sort of legislative framework that actually at times has been able to even impose its weight on the United States. I mean, we've seen that most recently with the Digital Services Act. Day-to-day folks, ordinary folks, maybe have most experienced it in their little bottle caps that no longer unscrew because we're saving the turtles. Do you feel like something like the EU has the ability to check or counterbalance perhaps some of the things we've seen take place in the US?
Well, yes, it has the ability. I mean, the EU is nothing but latent ability, right? It has all of these tools. It has all of this potential that for years and years has just kind of sat there on the table until all of these external shocks, whether out of Russia. I mean, I suppose you could include Brexit within that, but of course, the American democratic decline is front and center with that. And again, it's. What's the phrase? I think it was Oscar Wilde. Sometimes seeing the things that are right in front of your nose are most difficult of all. And it's entirely possible that what we are witnessing right here in 2026 is this renewed cohesion, not even renewed, a new cohesion of the European Union itself that is only going to continue paying dividends. But look, I hate to call the EU the last best option because I have continued faith in Canada's ability to punch above its weight, and continued faith in whether it's the South Koreans or the Australians or any kind of broader democratic polity or movement elsewhere to pick up the slack. But I hope it is that the European Union will continue to elevate its own focus on and prioritization of making sure to learn from all the lessons we see taking place in the United States. And what happens if you have unchecked finance, both from domestic and foreign sources, in your politics, and beyond that, what the kind of national security considerations are. So I hope so. Cautiously optimistic about where the EU is going. I will not be fully optimistic until Bosnia is, of course, accepted as a full member of the EU.
That's right.
A little bit longer.
We're gonna elevate that latent ability like no one else.
Right, that's right.
No, I mean, I think your caution is I think quite sober, and it's definitely shared by me, and I suspect many others. In a recent conversation, I think I described myself as like a disillusioned Europhile, or was it Reagan that had that line about? Or no, it was Churchill about being a conservative is a liberal that's been mugged by reality. Or
yeah. Someone has that quote.
Somebody has that. I apologize. You can call me out. Whoever's listening is like, no, it was actually whoever. Anyway, so I want to go back to this a little bit though. Okay, so we can't look to Europe to save America, but what can Susie Q Public, the average American voter, what should they be asking and looking for? We're going to have another set of elections in this country. Do you feel like, first and foremost, do you feel like it's on the radar? Is this conversation on the public policy radar? And then secondly, when we're thinking about actual policy implementation, what are you hoping for? What are you recommending to people that you're talking to on the Hill or wherever else?
So getting back to the definition of oligarchy, the clearest means of eliminating an oligarchy or reducing its influence is lowering the threshold of wealth inequality in a nation, in this case, the United States of America. And of course, you could do that two different ways, either by elevating the total wealth of those who are not oligarchs, or, as I argue in the book, far more easily mitigating some of that wealth that is accrued to these oligarchic figures. And generally speaking, that's going to come through taxation. Again, the book has far more detail about the decline of overall tax rates in the United States of America for this wealthiest class. I don't remember what year, 2017, 2018, one of those years not long ago, when the overall tax rate, the effective tax rate, what they're actually paying these oligarchic figures, what they're actually paying is now lower than, plumbers or electricians or you or me or anyone else in the United States of America. And that, taxation policy, and specifically the focus on using taxes and creatively to target much of that wealth, in addition to, again, transparency in the broader kind of offshoring kleptocratic world, prosecutions of those that are actually committing crimes, and using all the tools at your disposal. Of course, that's a broader suite of things, but it really does come down to taxes in the United States of America, including the creation, as the book describes, of a wealth tax, which is the overall assessment of a figure, in this case an oligarch's wealth, and whether it's 5%, 8%, 10%, you can kind of determine whatever figure you want at the end of the day. And which is funny because, I don't know how it sounds to you, Jasmin, but to an American ear, the idea of a wealth tax is almost kind of anti-American. Again,
that's right. It's taboo.
It's taboo. There's a John Steinbeck quote I have in the book where he says, there are no proletarians in America. We're all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires. This idea that, why would we tax the wealthiest because we'll be there someday. Anyways, you see that really beginning to shift now. This is a far more in the conversation now than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. And I suspect that will only continue to rise and rise in the years to come. And look, if you put a gun to my head and said, where are we going to be in 2028? I suspect this will be one of, if not the primary planks of policy discussion, maybe even debate, certainly on the Democratic side, although potentially on the Republican side too. I hesitate to make any predictions because I've been wrong about a billion things, but I suspect that's where things will continue to go in the United States.
So it's interesting you bring that Steinbeck quote up. I had actually just shared it with my dad a couple days ago when I had been visiting my folks in Vancouver, BC, and my dad of course loves to debate history and politics, and I had shared this. So my folks are in Canada. They're from Bosnia originally. They grew up in the former Yugoslavia. So I think there's a lot of these cultural norms, I would say, in the U.S. that feel quite alien to them. And so to describe American, I think, reticence and wariness of government overreach, even for the purposes of, shall we say, socioeconomic equalization. I shared the Steinbeck quote with them, and they were like, "Oh my God, that's amazing." I was like, "Yes, Steinbeck was an amazing writer. I highly recommend him." But so I'm, I think, again, I'm not the expert, but from what I've been able to glean, I do think there is a real meaningful attempt at, shall we say, rehabilitating the idea of taxation as a tool of social policy in the United States, and I think a lot of the developed world. I think I, broadly suspect that is a good direction. I'm in California, where there are folks trying to get on the ballot, if I'm not mistaken, a 5% one time. That's the interesting thing about it. A one-time 5% wealth tax. Do you feel like these kinds of one-off initiatives, can they pave the way towards, again, socializing this as a public policy option?
I think that's a good way to phrase it, paving the way, because this isn't, a one-time imposition of this tax. It's not a solution. It's not the solution. It's not the silver bullet. But I really, and to use an overused term, the Overton window on this does seem like it has shifted over the last, few years. That, as you said, this kind of rehabilitation of tax policy as a means of social governance has really reemerged in the U.S. and elsewhere. And I will say it's interesting because, one of the figures I had in mind about this potential debate in 2028 is Gavin Newsom down in California, because he has come out, as far as I have seen, against this taxation on California's wealthiest for the reason. And again, you see the logic to it, because, wouldn't these figures simply leave the state, remove that kind of tax base, leave their companies behind, whatever it might be, move to Texas and bring all their wealth there. And of course, that has been an argument that has been put forth for years and years. I described some of the recent academic literature on that concludes that no, the higher up you go the economic ladder, the less this kind of economic migration takes place. Of course, there are examples you can think of wealthy people leaving a state or a country, but generally speaking, they tend to remain even when higher taxes are imposed. And it also, look, without getting too, spiritual about it, right? This is the democratic procedure of a society or a state or a nation deciding that those wealthiest, those who benefited most from these societies, need to pay more. You can describe it as a fair share or whatever you want to describe it as, but this is the democratic method being implemented. And again, the wealthiest figures that it would target in terms of taxation can take it or leave it, but they have to recognize the democratic bona fides, the kind of underpinning of that, and again, where things are going moving forward.
Sure, and I think obviously the other major aspect of all of this, especially right now, given what's going on in the Persian Gulf, is the enormous rise in cost of living and energy costs in this country. I'm in Southern California. The gas station at the corner from our house, gas is going for just under $6 a gallon as of right now on April 2nd. It's
God.
It's
That's
tough.
Nuts.
It's crazy, right? Sure, you can find somewhere where it's whatever $5.90 or $5.89, but at this point you're, what is it? Counting angels at the head of a pin.
Yeah, that's insane. God.
Yeah, and I feel like there's something in, I think there's a lot of these interesting strands that are coming together as I'm hearing you talk and describing the situation. One is this kind of generational change, and we've seen it play out in a number of recent U.S. elections, including in, New York City, where you are. We're seeing it play out vis-a-vis the cost of living. And then these broader macro dynamics. I think for a lot of people, seeing Elon Musk doing whatever it was that he thought he was doing in the White House was really upsetting. Not even sort of getting into the whole Doge thing. I think the image of it was really quite distasteful, right? Because it felt vulgar and so obvious as to how it is that this man got to be there, and it was because he paid his way, right?
Yeah. Look, that's the beauty and the curse of the Trump era, whether it's Trump himself or Musk or the Trump children or Kushner. Everything is just so in your face. And inescapable. And even if many of these dynamics existed, whether under the Biden administration, the Obama administration, of course, you can go back decades, you go back centuries in the United States of America and find other examples of this kind of pay-to-play access. And of course, there have been other corruption scandals previously, but we'd never seen anything just as either in terms of the scope of Musk's donations to Trump and his campaign, or just the kind of in-your-face nature of it, the inescapable nature of it. is just something that unlike anything we've ever seen. And again, I suspect that has also, I guess, the book argues this to an extent, that is also what's propelled a lot of the support for some of these policies that you and I have talked about already, because it is just, and again, in addition to the cost of living, in addition to the rank corruption that we're also seeing, whether it's in the Trump family or others in the immediate Trump circle, it all adds up to more support for the kinds of, whether it's taxation or other policies that are needed moving forward to mitigate some of this oligarchy in the United States.
Well, it also kind of feels like a little bit of a riff on a stupid joke I used to have about the Balkans when I would do these, panel conversations when people would ask me about corruption, and the line was basically like, corruption implies the existence of a system that is being corrupted, which at that time in the Balkans I think we didn't have. I'm sometimes fearful with some of the stuff that we've seen over the last few years in this country that we're sort of veering towards that. That extreme. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but, just the when you're seeing some of the most brazen aspects, I think, of what you're describing in your work, it almost feels like there is no system being corrupted anymore. This is the system now, right?
Yeah.
This.
If there is any cause for well, not any, one of the primary causes for optimism, surprisingly so, perhaps, in the book, is that I was able to go through a couple other periods in American history to look at the kind of, comparative levels of wealth inequality and kind of related corruption of the American political establishment. One, of course, was the Gilded Age in the late 19th, early 20th century, and all of these, we call them tycoons, but you could just as easily call them oligarchs, buying access to American political power, and that eventually blowing up in scandal. And we see a number of reforms out of the, from the progressive era, the Teddy Roosevelt administration, et cetera, et cetera. But what was really interesting was going back through the Richard Nixon administration and looking at, it's fascinating to read these from a political science perspective, but also from reading them in the Trump era, because the parallels that emerge are very striking. Not necessarily, of course, there's 1,000 differences, but whether it is in terms of corporate payoffs and under-the-table bribes to Richard Nixon, his reelection campaign, his administration, whether it is, again, the kind of the opening of American politics to this kind of high-level donations, many of which, again, were perfectly legal at the time because the kind of legal architecture was not there. And then, of course, Nixon himself, using the IRS to target political opponents, talking about assassinating journalists and firebombing think tank, all these things that I think maybe a lot of people don't necessarily remember, even though, of course, Nixon blew up in the Watergate scandal. And then looking at all of the hearings and reforms that came after the Nixon administration, many of which succeeded for some time, although many of which have since fallen apart and need to be rehabilitated moving forward.
Well, even to just briefly touch on something that is close to your heart, I believe, there's, when we think about the media that is coming out in that era of the kind of late Nixon, even into the 80s, right? Even into the Reagan era, you think about these films from Scarface and The Godfather and Batman comic books. You and I last time discussed Batman extensively. I feel like there was a recognition in the sort of in the proverbial ether of the U.S. public that this was a major issue, and it wasn't just organized crime; it was organized crime's corruption of the democratic process and the rule of law.
Yeah, it's funny. I just finished a biography, and you're exactly right. And I'm happy we brought up Batman, Frank Miller, Year One, Long Halloween, all that stuff. The intersection of mafia states, organized crime, et cetera, et cetera. It's funny that you mentioned all that because I just finished this great book called The Last Honest Man. About a senator named Frank Church from the great state of Idaho who led this thing called the Church Committee after Watergate, which is now viewed as the kind of prime example of what a high-level hearing into corruption and related reforms can actually achieve. And it was fascinating for many reasons, one of which was the investigations from that committee into the linkages between Washington administrations and the White House and organized crime. And it wasn't Nixon that they focused on. It was the John F. Kennedy administration and its relationship and the CIA's relationship with any number of organized crime figures to try to assassinate people like Fidel Castro and a number of others. And so, yes, I'm just echoing your comments that it's all fascinating and sometimes depressing, but sometimes uplifting and Good to read Batman.
So, we're getting to the sort of near the end of our time, and I do want to ask you because, as I said at the onset, I'm a little bit aware of sort of your intellectual evolution over the years, and it's been wonderful to watch. I do sort of want to get you to tell me though, how do you start honing in on this as a subject? I mean, what is happening in your life that you come upon this as an issue, the issue of corruption and money, and and what is it that motivates you to write these, I think, 3 really remarkable books that, I mean, your writing is extremely accessible. I've read you for many, many years, and I think it's very compelling, and there's a reason why you've been successful. What is driving you to take this up as such a sustained project? And I also asked that as someone who's written a couple books. I know how much effort it takes to write a book, and the ability to take a topic and do it over 3 books is really incredible.
Well, thanks, Jasmin. That's very kind of you. I mean, I of course, on the one hand, I'm very grateful to have a wife who lets me do this.
There it is.
Many others in my life who are generous enough to let me do this. I mean, part of it is patriotism. I think that as an American, as someone who's born and raised in this country, I have, if you want to call it, a duty to use whatever latent talents I might have to help this nation move forward and be able to implement American interests as such, rather than the kind of private interests as well. I think for this book, of course, just as I'm sure you saw it, Trump's inauguration in 2025, the lineup of Zuckerberg, of Bezos, of Musk, of Sundar Pichai at Google, and a number of others at the inauguration, of course, coming on the heels of all of Musk's donations to Trump itself. Again, it's those moments that, of course, I didn't have any planning behind that, but to see this so in your face and so blatant, to say, okay, is there a book here? What does this moment mean? What is this all about? How did we get here? Where are we now? And where are we moving forward? And look, at the end of the day, and you and I have talked about this, I think, previously. I was fortunate enough 1,000 years ago to be a Peace Corps volunteer in Kazakhstan, where I lived and worked as just an idiot 23-year-old as an English teacher living along the Kazakh-Russian border. But it was that time living and working there underneath a kleptocratic, they wanted to be hereditary, didn't end up being, kleptocratic dictatorship of Nursultan Nazarbayev. And again, seeing where that infrastructure and healthcare budgets were not going to the people on the ground, but to the ruling elite, moving their money, hiding their money, hiring lobbyists, et cetera, to whitewash their image. And so I've said this about the last few books. I'll say about it this one. I have Nazarbayev to thank for this one as well. And also at that point, again, to that point, being able to then come back to the States and enroll in a grad program up at Columbia, where I met you, who helped open my eyes to many of these, of course, similar dynamics, but also new networks, new avenues, and new realities on the ground, and of course, all kinds of new histories, whether in the Western Balkans or frankly elsewhere, that I am still grateful for. And Jasmin, I still follow your work for your own political analysis of where things are moving in Bosnia and elsewhere in the region. And again, it's no surprise that figures like Jared Kushner, who I describe in great detail in the book, have been showing up more and more recently in the Western Balkans, in this case in Albania, to set up brand new investments. Even though his Serbian hotel project fell through, poor guy.
Things are tough everywhere you go these days, and
home ownership, so expensive.
Home ownership / luxury hotel ownership has become unavailable to the average man. No, look, I think there is. I think there's actually a really, really important aspect to what you've just said. I mean, obviously, I'm fascinated by your personal trajectory, and I love the idea of dedicating books to Central Asian dictators. I think that's a policy that we should all adopt.
Yes, often overlooked as a source of inspiration.
Big shout out to Turkmenbashi et al. No, I mean, I think this idea of what you are trying to do with your work as an expression of genuine patriotism, genuine love of country, I think is really powerful, right? Like, I mean, and I feel that very intensely. I'm a naturalized American, but I feel a very strong attachment to this country, and I feel very strongly about the idea of using my expertise, my knowledge, my connections to aid this country in becoming, dare I say, once more a force for good, which I think historically it has aspired to be, whatever the flaws of its execution. I think there's something to that. That feels very important.
There was a I can't remember the title. I'm sorry, Jasmin. I have to look up the title of the book here, because this is I don't cite it in my new book itself. I'm sorry. You might have to pause the podcast here for a second, because I want to get it right. Okay, so there's a book that I read a few years ago, which is, you read these, you read plenty, but every once in a while you have a book that just kind of sticks with you for years and years. And there's a book that came out a couple years ago called The Cause of All Nations by Don Doyle. And it looked at the kind of international context surrounding the American Civil War, and specifically the broader democratic context surrounding the American Civil War, and how, in this case, it was a number of European states, of course, kind of the imperial centers of another number of European countries, kind of waiting with bated breath for the outcome of the American Civil War, to see whether or not this kind of renewed democracy would flourish, or at the end of the day, whether this, as I describe in the book, slave-owning oligarchy would prove victorious, and what that would mean for democracy on this planet moving forward. And that is we're far from, thankfully, anything quite like that taking place in the United States right now. But if you squint, you can kind of see the contours of it. And I would like to think that if we can right this ship and find and implement the kinds of reforms that are needed now more than ever, then that can act as a renewed burst of inspiration for democracy around the world. Because frankly, I don't want to think about the alternative.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I'll tell you, just between you and I and the people listening, when I had my naturalization ceremony, it was obviously a very special and emotional day for me. And when I, finished everything up and I left the building and I got in the car, and this was still during the era of COVID, so there's like myself and another lady that were allowed during the ceremony.
Yeah.
And I got in the car, and the thing that I put on the radio, or not on the radio, I started streaming very, very loud. It's a Irish Civil War ballad from one of the, I believe, one of the New York regiments, and it's called "We Fight for Uncle Sam," and it's this really beautiful, powerful ballad about bringing their experience of Irish republicanism and the cause of Irish independence into the American Civil War, seeing those synergies and devoting themselves equally to both. And it's a song that I'd sort of become aware of a number of years earlier, and it felt very special and appropriate to me.
One of the underappreciated elements that led to Union victory ultimately in the American Civil War was immigrants. The South had so few of them, and so few who were willing to fight, and the North, the Union, the United States had so many who were willing to fight and die for it. So I don't know that chant, but I'll listen to it later today.
There you go. There you go. Well, I think this is a beautiful moment to end on. Casey, thank you very, very much for your time again. We've had two conversations out kind of about the same subject, but they've gone in very different directions, and I think that I think that speaks to the significance and power of your work. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, man.
For your time.
Thank you, my friend. And look, if we have to do it a third time, I would be happy to. That's no problem.
Inshallah. Thank you, brother.
Thanks, Jasmin.